From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, I'm Gail Sharazia, the Israel Judaica section of the Library of Congress. I want to welcome you to today's program, Forgotten Transports. Before we begin, I would like to mention some of our upcoming programs. There's a list of them on the table in the back. Tomorrow we have a program on the Jüdische Kulturband, and that's at 12 o'clock in the Mary Pickford. And next week we have Ilona Frankel coming to speak about her new book of memoirs called Girl. I would like to mention that today's program is co-sponsored by the European Division, Motion Picture Recorded Sound Division, Hebraic Language Table, in cooperation with the Embassy of the Czech Republic and the Rabin Chair at GW University. I want to thank the European Division, Mike Mushan at MBRS, Audrey Fisher in the Public Affairs Office, Galina Tevorovsky of our section, the Law Library and their staff, Mary Fetsko, and the Czech Embassy. And I would like to welcome from the Czech Embassy the head of diplomacy. Where are you, Pavla? Over there. And the cultural attaché of the Czech Embassy. Right over there. Thank you for coming and for doing all these wonderful programs with us. Our speaker, Lukasz Privo, studied politics and Near Eastern studies at Brandeis University and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He studied religion and human rights at Columbia University, history at the Central European University in Budapest, and Jewish religion and philosophy in Sweden. He's published on various aspects of Jewish history and curated exhibits at the Jewish Museum in Prague. He's also served as the first director of the European Shoah Legacy Institute, and currently he's the director of the Czech Cultural Center in Tel Aviv. Lukasz will show clips and discuss his body of works, 4 award-winning films, followed by the Q&A. This is being webcast, so if you do not wish to appear in the webcast, please leave during the question and answer period. And please shut off your cell phones. So now the floor, Lukasz.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming to see me. I have to admit this is a very strange occasion for me because I'm used to talking after the films, and I was really puzzling myself with how to talk about my films without revealing too much and still making you to come and see them. And today at 4 in the morning, I very jet-lagged, woke up, opened the internet, found out the results of the election, and sort of had this moment of enlightenment and decided to completely change my talk because I realized that everything I do and everything I've studied, the thing that I'm interested in most is stories. And talking about a film, which is a story in itself, or 4 films in this case, which create an even larger picture and actually tell a bigger story, is so hard that I decided that I'm going to speak a little bit about the story behind the films, not the films themselves. And if you find the story behind the films interesting, hopefully you will go and see the films themselves and find the films interesting as well. So people often ask me how I got to make films, since, as you heard, I'm not a filmmaker by training, and my primary focus was always politics and history. And I have to say it was the stories really that brought me to it, because and why the Holocaust? It goes back to my childhood love of guns, because I could never own a gun, not even a plastic one. And I always wanted, because all the kids at the playground, of course, ran around with these plastic toys, and my mom would never ever allow me to have one. And one day I managed to borrow one from a friend whose name I still remember, David, and came home. And I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, where you had all these Russian movies with people fighting the Germans, and the Germans running around with machine guns and shouting "Hände hoch," hands up. And I know a little bit of German because my mom sometimes spoke to my grandfather in German when they didn't want me to understand. But I didn't know what that means. I just saw it from the movies. And so I snuck up on my grandfather and shouted "Hände hoch." And I'll never forget his face, because he turned completely white and sort of froze. And I dropped the gun. I ran away crying. And since then, I haven't touched a gun, plastic one or real. And I realized that there is something in the past of my grandfather that is strange, that is not completely normal. And it was I realized it more and more, because I grew up surrounded by these elderly ladies without families, and they always swooned on me, because whenever they saw a kid, they came, and I still remember, sort of from my perspective of a kid, when they're coming down on me and pinching my cheeks, and I was totally terrified of them. And so I even used to say, whenever I saw one of them approaching, I would say, "Look, it's Sibyl Oslava Osum," which meant my name, the city I was born in, because that was one of the questions they always asked, like they wouldn't know, and my age, which is 8. I don't know why, because I probably didn't know any other number then. And but later on, I realized that these ladies do not have kids of their own, because they all lost them during the war and during the Holocaust. And as I was growing up, I kind of thought about the Holocaust as something that everyone goes through. Like, you go to the army, you go to the camp, it's normal. And then as I was in high school, I realized it's not actually completely normal to go to a concentration camp. And I started finding out more about my family and the 60 people who did not make it in my family. And my mom and my aunt, they didn't really know much, because my grandmother died when just as I was born, and my grandfather never really spoke about it. But I was getting more and more interested in this history, and especially about the history of my grandfather, because I really loved him and he influenced me tremendously. And I found out that he was actually deported in the very first deportation of the Second World War, which was already in October 1939. It was, we could call it Eichmann's first deportation scheme, when the Nazis were really learning how to deport people. The whole scheme didn't work out. It was quite unsuccessful. They deported a lot of people from Moravia, from Ostrava, where my family is from, Upper Silesia. But the camp itself couldn't actually, they were building it, the deportees themselves were building it. It couldn't accommodate all the prisoners. And a lot of them were chased out or escaped from the camp to the Soviet-occupied part of Poland, when Germans and Russians, or Nazis and Soviets, divided up the territory of Poland, and ended up, most of them were picked up by the NKVD, the precursor of the KGB. And I'll come back to the KGB later, because I searched their archives. And ended up in the Gulag. That's how some of the people survived. And my grandfather was one of 20 who actually went through Nisko, and subsequently was returned to Ostrava, which was very strange in the history of concentration camps, or camps, Nazi camps in general. And then he was subsequently deported again. And when my grandfather died when I was 10, but I was rummaging through his stuff, and I actually found photographs from Nisko, from the camp. And at that time I realized that there is actually visual material of almost everything. It's just you need a lot of luck or a lot of persistence to find it. And I started to be interested not only in the history of the Holocaust, but also in sort of the visual part of the Holocaust, about the visual record of it. Because watching a lot of documentaries, I realized that they do not really depict the life of the people who went through it, and the most crucial period. You have a lot of footage that comes from the period just before the Holocaust or just after the Holocaust. So you have footage from German newsreels with Nazis marching with torches and so on. But that's not the perspective of the Jews, because you would have to be crazy or suicidal to go to a Nazi march. You closed your window and you tried to pretend that you're not home. So this was not the experience of the Jews. And then you have the what you can call the post-Holocaust footage, the liberation footage. But this is again something that is more from the perspective of the liberators, and this is the aftermath. This is the end. But what happened in between? And that was really what I was most interested in. And when I was researching Nisko, which actually turned out to be in my BA thesis, I realized that there are so many other places that nothing is known about them, that nothing has been written about, that there are no documentaries about. Krechov, Izbical, Luta, all these places where Czech Jews were deported to. I was mostly focusing on Czech Jewry and Central European Jewry. And I couldn't really find anything about that except for the names of these camps, or rather places. And why wasn't there anything? Because most of these places ceased existing already in 1943, 44 at most. They were liquidated, and they were liquidated with all the people in them. So the survival rate was really not even in percentages. It was less than that. And we have come to associate Auschwitz with all the evil because it was such a huge death factory. But these much smaller places were often equally deadly or even more so. And I realized that from about 40% of Czech Jews did not perish in these big extermination centers, but rather in places in Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Eastern Poland, and so I decided that when I was looking for when I was looking for this material on Nisko, I started collecting all the other material I could find on these other camps. And then eventually I actually met some of the first people who survived these places, and I realized that none of them had been interviewed before. And often their experience was so different from the survivor story that we know, the phone number to heaven on the arm and the striped uniforms, that they often even were not part of sort of the survivor circles or sort of fell through the cracks. They were not interviewed by these big interviewing schemes like Spielberg's Foundation and so on. So I started approaching them, and I was thinking that what would be the best medium to capture the history and what they were saying, what they were telling me, and realized that book is not doing it justice, because the people were themselves so interested. As I told you at the very beginning, I'm most interested in stories, and people have stories, and people tell stories in a certain way, and it's really important to see how they are telling the stories, and the humor, and the gestures, and the facial expressions, and that's the only way to capture that is on film. I can write a book, but book is quite difficult because you have to work with the imagination of the reader, and the reader has to be an active participant, really. But film is the most approachable media, because you can screen it to a hall full of high school kids, and if it has a story, they might at the very beginning not pay any attention, but they slowly get into it and then they watch it. They won't read a book. So I decided to make films. Not being a filmmaker, it might have been a bit of an audacious enterprise, but I know a lot of people in the film world, and I think if you work hard, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and if you work with good people, and I managed to assemble a really good team, you can do films even if you're not a filmmaker. So, when I was thinking how to do the films, I realized, again, watching a lot of documentaries, that most of them are told from, again, from the perspective of the Nazis, from the perspective of the liberators, or from the perspective of the narrator. But this is like a bird's eye view. We are talking on behalf of the witnesses, and I wanted the people to tell their stories themselves. So one of the first decisions that I took making these films was that there won't be any narration, that I won't have a commentary, that everything will be told basically from bottom up, and that I'll take the interviews and these very narrow perspectives of the individual people that I recorded and create the picture from that. Because even films that I really admire, like Shoah's, like Lanzmann's Shoah, for example, there you don't have a narration, but you have commentary by historians, which is just a more sophisticated version of a commentary. So I wanted to have the Jewish perspective, and even though we went and interviewed also the so-called bystanders and quite a few Nazis or Nazi-affiliated troops from the countries they occupied, I did not want to include that in the film. I wanted to be consistent with that one perspective. So in the end, it worked out that there were 4 films. Each of the films is focused on one destination where transports of Czech Jews left to, and on one particular group of people, and we could call it a mode of survival. Of course, it's not a recipe for survival, because there is no such thing. You only know what works in a particular set of conditions after you survive, if you're lucky enough. But basically, they were done in a chronological order as the transports left. And the very first transports left for Riga and for Latvia in early 1942. And those were, and the film about Latvia is really a story of families, how they try to cope in completely atrocious conditions of the Riga ghetto and keep a semblance of normalcy. So children went to school, but on the way to school they actually had to pass by the gallows where there was always someone hanging, and things like that. The film about Belarus is really a story of men only, because from the deportees to Belarus there was a single female survivor. All the other people, all the other survivors were men, and it's really a film about resistance, both armed and unarmed, but mostly armed, of people escaping from the camps, from the death camps, and joining the partisans and fighting. The third film in the series about Estonia is a story of women only, because unlike in Belarus, there were absolutely no male survivors from the deportees to Estonia, and there were only women, and they survived in a very strange way, because they sort of created a large living organism. They bonded so much that they gave up their individual thinking, you can say, and and they did everything together. So which greatly helped them to survive. They really surrounded themselves by this bubble, and they refused to believe what was going on around them. They convinced themselves that they'll survive, that they'll come back, and they'll meet their families. It was an illusion. Their families were, of course, they were already dead, but this is what kept them going. And the last film about the 14,000 Czech deportees to the Lublin region, out of which 50 people survived, and they all survived thanks to running away. And basically, it's a film about identity, because to escape, you have to assume a new name, you have to assume a new story, you have to believe your story enough to be convincing. But at the same time, when I talked to the people who lived under this assumed identity, they told me you can't lose yourself in this identity too much, because the moment you become that person, you stop being careful, and that's when you die. So this constant acting, that you act, that it stops being acting, but you still have to keep in mind that you're someone else, that you're pretending to be someone. And so these 4 films actually stand on each on their own, can be screened independently, have their own structure. But if you see all 4 of them together, there is an overarching logic to them. So I would never use a story that I tell in one film won't be in another film. So there are certain horizontal themes, be it love or shoes, for example. So in the film about Latvia, you learn how shoes can help you get food for your kids. In Belarus, how shoes make you an unlikely and unwantingly a war hero. In Estonia, how you survive selection thanks to shoes, and in Poland, what happens if you lose them. So there are these stories that connect the films, but they work on their own. So in the films also, I decided that as I told you about the story about Nisko and the story of the pictures that I found, I decided that I'll illustrate everything in the films by time and place precise pictures, that I won't use any make-believe footage, no post-war footage unless it's really of liberation, but I won't supply what really annoys me in many documentaries is that, for example, someone is talking about Dachau and you see footage from Bergen-Belsen, and it's actually something that really undermines the message, because first we become immune to these images because they get recycled too much. And second, also the deniers of the Holocaust use this as a proof. Look, you just have some strange footage and you keep recycling it and always claim that this is some other place. So I decided that I'll really look for it everywhere, which ended up being over 30 countries. And we filmed in over 20 countries on 5 continents. And the material really comes from all kinds of sources, but I'll come back to that. The most important thing at the very beginning was to find the people, and as I mentioned, 80-90% of them had not been interviewed before, and kind of got lost, because I had relatively very precise deportation records. I had rather accurate survival records, because people mostly came back. When they came back from the war, they registered with the communities and they wanted to look for their families and so on. So they registered. Even though I did find some people who were not on these lists, because having survived and actually having witnessed the death of their families, they had no reason to go home and left for another country immediately. So, for example, in Australia, we found mother and daughter who survived the Riga ghetto. The mother was the oldest person that we interviewed. She was 103 years old when we talked to her. Because I looked for everyone at that time until the age of 100. And she was over that. So I started with these lists of survivors. Then I went through marriage records, because a lot of the women married shortly after the war, and also if there were not always I could find it, but name change records, because one of the funny things in Czech is that you will have a lot of people with German sounding names, and they're mostly not Jewish, because a lot of the Jewish families changed their German-sounding names, surnames after the war to Czech-sounding ones. And then, of course, emigration records, which were really helpful, because not always they told me where they went, but the more you know, the more you can judge where these people could have emigrated to, depending on the year. So in 1945, people who left were mostly people who went as far as possible, New Zealand, Australia. Those were people who knew that there was no one who survived, and they just went directly, and they wanted to be as far away from Europe as possible. 1948 was another big wave of emigration, and most of these people went to North America and South America. And surprisingly, they did not go to Israel. And I was wondering why, and it was because the survival rate from the places that I was researching was so low. There were actually individual survivors, and Israel, at least in its inception, was a very collective country, and people left there collectively too. But these people did not have any friends from the camps. They had no relatives. They were only by themselves. So unless they belonged to some, let's say, Zionist movement or youth movement before the war, and they actually managed to reconnect with someone they knew from before the war, they did not leave on these in this emigration wave. And then there was a third wave in 1968, when the Soviets and the Soviet Pact invaded Czechoslovakia. And surprisingly, these people went mostly to Germany. And but by then it was not so surprising, because they knew the language, they were middle-aged, so they often had families, and if they had the son, they knew that the son would not have to go to the army, being Jewish, which was in the 60s quite a important factor. Also, they already had new friends and new relationships that they established after the war in post-war Czechoslovakia, and it's much easier to keep in touch with someone in Czechoslovakia across the Iron Curtain from Germany than from Australia. So, and there were other factors. They got citizenship almost instantly. They got some financial help and so on. And Germany by then was a democrat. I'm talking, of course, the western part of it. So by then it actually did a great deal of denazification. This helped me to look for the people. But still, they were often not registered. The people I was specifically looking for were often not registered with Jewish communities and so on. So searching for them this way turned rather futile. What helped me most, and my mom still hates me for it, because we still in the attic have hundreds of phone books. And Jews are city people, so when they left, they usually settled in cities. And if you could at least tell in which direction they went, let's say some Northern American cities, I collected phone books from the big cities, and if the name was not too common, I just started calling everyone of that particular name. And you can always tell whether you call the right person by the reaction, because you dial and you say, excuse me, were you in, I'm not sure I'm calling the right person, but were you in Salaspils? And if they say what, you got the wrong person. If they ask, who are you, what do you want, you know, you hit the jackpot. Now you couldn't do it. Actually, now you have Mr. Google to help you, but it's much more difficult now because no one has a landline anymore. Everyone has a cell phone, and the cell phones are not registered. So actually, I was working in this perfect timing because you already had some phone books online. You already could Google, or not pre-Google, whatever that was, look up some stuff online, but you could still reach people through the phone. So this search would not be successful now. And once you find the person, you have to convince him or her to talk to you, which often took me up to 2 years. As I mentioned, these people were often very wounded, and sometimes they even felt that they are shunned by the other survivors, because our preconception is that if something is horrible, we hear about it. So we know that Auschwitz was absolutely atrocious. So it must have been horrible. But have we heard about Luta? No. Means it couldn't have been that bad there, because if it were it so bad, we would have heard about it. But the fact is, no one survived Luta. So that was so. If you say I survived Salaspils, the other survivors often say, "So what? You know, I was in a much worse place. You can't understand me." So these people didn't want to talk, and sometimes I had to go. For example, one of the most crucial witnesses who was living in New York, a fantastic lady. I went to see her in New York 3 times, and always, as we set up the camera, she just said, "Okay, I can't do it." So you had to be quite persistent in. And why did they in the end talk to me? It was because I think it was because first I got lucky with the timing, because most of these people were advanced in age, and they started to realize that if they don't tell it now, they never will. Second, the atmosphere changed, because thanks to these big interviewing schemes, even though they chose not to participate in them, other people around them were talking, and that makes a huge difference. And also, their whole lives, they were looking ahead. They were trying to raise families, work, whatsoever, all these things. But now they had actually time to reflect. So that was a helping factor. And then also I realized that when they were approached by, and they told me themselves when they were approached by interviewers, even in the cases when they were, the questions were wrong. Because the places that they survived were so specific that the general questions for, without diminishing it, the general survivor of the Holocaust would not fit, and they get upset. And when I talk to them, they realize that I know sometimes more than they do, because I knew the context, I knew the background, I knew the documents. And very often it happened that they actually started talking to me like I was there, even though I was 70 years younger than they sometimes. They started talking to me like I was there with them, and they said, "Do you remember when they separated us and then we went there and there?" And of course I couldn't remember it, but I knew what happened. And I knew the names they were mentioning, which also greatly helped me to cross-check the information they were giving me. So there were some incredible stories, really. I think the people really wanted to tell, but they were waiting for someone who would match their idea of who to tell it. It's very difficult to tell it to someone from your family. You almost never do that. But if you have someone who knows enough that you can relate to, but at the same time doesn't really show much emotion, and that's, I will come back to it. I had to develop my own interviewing technique. Then you can get this information. And sometimes you had really incredible stories. For example, we flew halfway around the world to Denver. I remember this interview very well because when I was flying back, I landed and the Twin Towers went down on the day I landed. But we had this interview set up with this old gentleman who was a survivor of a labor camp, Treblinka, which was right next to the death camp. Very few people know about it. And in the end, we decided not to tell it in the film, but it was an important interview. But when we arrived to Denver, we found out that the man was in a coma. So I talked to the family, and his daughter said, "Look, I'm okay with it. If you want, go and talk to him. I mean, he's dying." And I talked to the physicians, and they said, "There's nothing to lose, sure." So we went, and when I started talking, whispering into his ear, the man suddenly sat up with a pipe in his arms and had a black kippah on. He wasn't religious before the war. He was one of the few who turned religious after. Usually it was the opposite. And he talked to us on camera for 2 hours. Then he said goodbye to his family and died 12 hours later. And it was literally seeing someone rise from the dead to tell a story. It was quite an incredible experience. Yes, I was partly lucky, but you have to ask the right question. And I mentioned that I developed my own interviewing technique because I read a lot of books about psychology and police manuals about how to interrogate people and things like that, but nothing would fit perfectly. And then I realized that I both trust and mistrust human memory. It can be an excellent source, but you have to be very careful with it. And my most favorite answer from anyone is I don't know. Because the moment people tell you I don't know, they're reliable witnesses. What happened, I was also lucky because I was interviewing people from places that were so unknown that there were no documentaries, no books. So there was no integration of post-war knowledge into their memory. And for example, I interviewed a lot of people from Auschwitz also. And basically almost everyone tells you, and there was Mengele, and he was sending people to the left and to the right. And I came there and I was sent there and my family. The memory itself is correct, but Mr. Mengele wasn't standing there and saying, "Hello, good morning, welcome to Auschwitz, and please go to I'm Mengele and go to the right." How did they know the name? It's after. They remember the face of the officer, but there were dozens of officers who were carrying out these selections. Mengele is just a symbol. So this is a name that's floating around and you attach it to but it already makes the interview somewhat slanted, because you know that they talked to other survivors, they read books, saw documentaries. The same thing, for example, I survived a handful of people who were in Auschwitz almost for the duration of its existence from Slovakia. And I asked them, when you arrived, where did you get off? And suddenly there was this pause. You could see them thinking. And they said, on the ramp? And there was no ramp in 1942. It was built in 1944. But because 99.9% who survived Auschwitz say they got off on the ramp, which in their case is correct, they doubted their own memories because they thought, not all these people cannot be wrong. So they started justifying their own memory by saying, but I think I was at the back and we stood a little bit behind the ramp, so we were actually jumping into mud. But it was because there was no ramp. So with my witnesses, I was actually lucky in the sense that they often answered, "I don't know, I wasn't there." And knowing even names, for example, I memorized because I was looking for every single person on the list to find material. I knew them by heart, so they often mentioned, like, "Do you remember Peter? And he was in love with this blonde girl. What was her name?" And I know the name, but I would never provide this information. So I offer 5 names, and if they pick the right one, it confirms another interview that I have. Another thing that kind of united the witnesses that I talked to was that they were extremely intelligent people, but most of them were not philosophers, what I call philosophers. People who are into introspection, and they tend to relive their memories. Because if you revisit your memory too often, you change it. I noticed it when I was talking to high schools, for example, and sometimes you can already, you hear the questions tend to repeat it themselves, and I know what works and doesn't work with the audience. So even when telling my own story of making the film, or I tend to change it. It's like with a joke that you tell often. The more often you tell it, the better you tell it, but it's very different 100th time than the first time you tell it. And so I admire people, for example, survivors who can go to schools and tell their stories, but I would never use them in the film because I know that the story is no longer the story that I want to hear. I want it to it's like with a diamond, if you find it rough, diamond looks like any other stone. You have to polish it, and then it takes shape, but it's a very different stone. For example, you can always tell watching a documentary whether someone is talking for the first time or not, but lots of documentaries actually kind of, I find it voyeuristic, but have the people in the film, you see how they are tearing up. People who speak for the first time, they never cry. Because it's so difficult to actually, if you lock something inside yourself for 50, 60, 70 years, to tell it after such a long time, it takes so much energy and concentration that you don't actually have energy left to cry. It's only the second, third time that you are telling it, is that you gain the distance from your own story, and then you can start actually feeling sorry about yourself, and that's when you start crying. It works. I mentioned the police manuals. It actually works. If the trauma is really fresh, then you have different reactions. You have tears or not, but with the distance in time, you usually don't get that on the very first when you're telling the story for the first time. Regarding the interviewing technique also, I realized that when you are convincing people to talk, and sometimes one of the techniques that I used was with people who did not want to talk to me, is I knew that deep down they really wanted to talk, but how to convince them. So I interviewed everyone around them. Their friends, completely unrelated topics, not even about the Holocaust sometimes. And then they eventually come back to you and say, okay, so why is everyone so interesting and I'm not? And I said, well, 2 years ago I asked you for an interview, and about 50 times in the meantime. But then they start talking. And when you finally agree to an interview, you start to prepare. Like, yet today I woke up at 4 in the morning and decided that I'm going to talk about something completely else, but that's a different story. But before that, I was actually preparing a talk, thinking of what I'm going to tell you. And usually you structure the story chronologically. You decide what you're going to include and what you're going to leave out. But it's your call what you consider interesting. which is usually the things that they considered interesting but not so interesting, and the things that they leave out are the most interesting to you. So you have to get those other things, but in a way that they don't realize that you're doing it. Because very often these things are the most traumatic, or there are things when they are not completely sure that they acted in a moral way, or that the decision was right, or very often there is some kind of sexual abuse, things like that they keep for themselves. So I let them start telling the story the way they want, and they eventually get used to the light, they forget about the camera in the corner, and they get more comfortable with you. And then I start asking very, very specific targeted questions that completely break down the narrative and make it in a complete mess of it. Because one of the basic things is that whatever question you ask, you get an answer of equal length. So if you ask something general, you get an answer that lasts, let's say, 3 minutes. If you ask a very, very specific question, you get also 3 minutes. But the 3 minutes, you have so much more detail in those 3 minutes, of course. And by ways of association, and it looks like these questions are completely chaotic, but I know what I'm doing, and then I say, oh, sorry, I got completely confused now. Can you please tell me again? I totally don't understand what was happening. And they start telling you the story again, but with all the details that they skipped at the very beginning. And it's also good for editing, because you have the story both in a condensed version, longer version, and so you can work with that in terms of film. You do look like an idiot asking these questions, but that's the price you have to pay for it. And you have to stay neutral, because people are really like a mirror. You can very often in documentaries, you can totally see on the people who are talking, you can see what the facial expression of the interviewer was, because they reflect it. So if you even though they're telling something absolutely horrible, you cannot really show horror, and that also helps you to get across the inevitable moments when they start to break down, because you say, look, we have a job to do. You agreed to this interview, so please let's get on with it. And they snap and they start talking. The moment you sympathize with them too much, of course you sympathize, of course it hurts, you and them, everyone, but you can't show it too much, because it might destroy the interview. And my interviews tend to be very, very long, sometimes 12 hours. And that's when we really go through these very, very specific questions, because of course I know that I'm not going to use them in the film, and we filmed over 400 hours. I'm not talking about some extra footage of places that were disappearing at that time, or interviews with bystanders and some of the Nazis. I might come back to that if we have time, which I should check. Okay, we don't have much time, so I'll show you also some clips. I decided not to use any clips from the films themselves, because the films are each 90-minute long, and they're linear stories. So they're sentence by one person, another sentence by another person, and without the context, you don't really get a picture. But I'll show you some. For example, I mentioned the Salaspils asking. So there's one man, he's talking in English also. And I'll show you some of the material that I found, because as I said, I believe there is a visual record of everything. So this is from a camp called Salaspils in Latvia.
And in the morning when you woke up, the person on your right was dead, and the person on your left was dying, and the person behind you didn't get up, and you were very surprised that you were still around, that you were still functioning relatively normally, relative to the conditions in which you got up and went down and lined up on the appel and stood in the sub-zero temperatures for an hour or so before you went to work.
So the photographs that you saw in the film, they are really of Salaspils in 1942. I could even identify certain people on some of the pictures, and the material, I told you already how I was looking for people. I was looking the same way for photographs or footage. Very often I found it depends on the place, but let's say in Poland I went around and I traded bottles of vodka for photographs. I felt a little bit like a Santa Claus because they already knew by the, whenever I drove into the village and my trunk was full of alcohol, and you got drunk with the men, and suddenly they started bringing you these photographs because in the camps in the Lublin region, they usually did not have a permanent Nazi unit stationed there. They had the Nazi officers actually administered several camps, and the camps themselves were run by Ukrainian. They call them Charny, blacks, because of their black uniforms. And of course, these soldiers, they had access to the warehouses where the property stolen from the Jews was, and they went out with the Polish village girls, and the transports from Czech, they were rich transports of stuff they never saw in Eastern Poland. So they were the girls, the perfumes and all that stuff. Even though it was forbidden, the Jews always brought a camera, one of them. It was in the warehouses. The Ukrainians didn't know how to operate cameras, but they wanted a picture with their girlfriends. So they asked the Jew to take a picture. And you have the Charny with his girlfriend, and you have the entire village standing behind them because they also wanted a picture. Because most of the places were so poor that you had pictures taken at your baptism, marriage, and then, strange enough, custom of your dead body in a coffin. But those were the only pictures that you accumulate throughout your life. So they all wanted pictures, and the Jews who knew how to take a camera took pictures of the villagers and traded them, developed them, and traded them for food. So very often in the houses there, you find the same picture because they made multiple copies and they gave them to people and for food. So but you have to go to the houses. Funnily enough, when you get drunk with the men, they are now married to these girlfriends of these Ukrainians. And they never forget, because there were, even during and after the war, there was a sort of a civil war going on between the Poles and the Ukrainians, and they never forgot and forgave their wives for going out with a Ukrainian. So, and the women always keep pictures. Men don't, but women do. Soldiers keep pictures, because those are the most sort of the best times of their lives. But so they always know where the women have the pictures. They get drunk. They start rummaging through a closet, take out a shoebox with the photos, and they tell you, this is my wife, this is the Ukrainian. They remember his name, and they can name even some of the Jews on the pictures. And that's how you, for example, find pictures. Another one was Jews were used for slave labor. Mostly digging melioracja, these drainage canals, and it's a very swampy region. But it's technically quite a difficult task, so you had to have Poles from the cities, engineers, come and design these works. And they had cameras, so they took pictures of of themselves with the Jews from Western and Central Europe, because they had much more in common with these people than with the poor villagers, with the Poles themselves. But the Poles from the village remembered the names of these engineers, so they give me the name. I go and I look up all the people of that name in Poland. Then I find the engineer. I find the family, usually. They have an album. I take the album. I go back to the village, and they identify the people. And that's how you find pictures. The same thing works with Nazis. Germans are people who do not move much. So even when there were post-war trials and investigations on Nazis, I find an old address. And I go to the towns, and I find the families, and they always have something, because soldiers never give up their pictures, even though often it's basically incriminating evidence against them. They mostly keep it. So there are many, many other techniques like this. I don't know if I have... How much time do we have, Gil? Okay, I'll play some more. Okay, yeah, I'll play this.
Jednoho dne se rozšířila fáma, že budou vybírat děti. Tam bylo několik dětí, 20, 30, nevím. A že je někam budou odvážet. A to byl signál pro všechny matky, aby ty děti někam skovali. A ono nebylo kam. A přišla ke mně ta paní jedna z Vilny a říkala, vy přece znáte tu naši holčičku, tam byla asi 5-6 roků stará. No, já samozřejmě lidi každý den vidím, tak prosím vás, víte, co se říká, já ji potřebuju skovat. A měli jsme denní a noční směny, takže my jsme někdy spali přes den. A ona řekla, prosím vás, já bych tu holčičku strčila pod tu rohovou postel, ona všemu rozumí, já jí to vysvětlím a po vás bych chtěla, abyste tu deku, kterou jste přikrytá, pustila tak, jako že jste se odkopala a pustila jste ji hodně hluboko, aby tam nebylo vidět. No tak měla jsem dost strachu, ale řekla jsem, jo, to udělám. No a pak tam chodili ty SSáci a všude se koukali a děti žádný nebyly. A taky kolem ty postele naší šli a šli dál. No a za hodinu, za 2, nevím, byl tento úkon ukončen a ta holčička vylezla, teda maminka ji vyzvala a ona měla úplně obličej stařeny 80letý, celá žlutá byla, úplně změněná, ztratila prostě dětskou tvář.
Yeah, so that's, for example, the example that people don't actually cry, that they are on the brink, but if they are telling it for the first time, like this lady in Switzerland, they don't go over, and that's the moment how you can also judge whether they're actually talking for the first time. Basically, these clips are clips of interviews with some illustrations. They're not completely part of the films. Sometimes I use a sentence or two, but I think they illustrate what I'm saying better than the films themselves, because in the film there's literally a story behind every photograph, every story. I mentioned KGB, for example. I smuggled stuff from the KGB archives. In Belarus, the KGB is still called the KGB, and they wouldn't let me in. I wrote them a letter many times, never received an answer, and so I went there personally when I finally got my visas to Belarus, and they wouldn't let me into the archive. So I decided that the only way is to contact the director, but the names of directors of, I don't know how it is here with FBI or CIA or whatever, but they're not exactly listed in phone books. So it was still not too many cell phones around, so I bought a bunch of calling cards. I went into a phone booth right in front of the KGB building, And you can call the organization, it's an institution. So I called the KGB and I spoke partly in English, partly in Russian, depending who I was talking to. And I was telling them, look, I need to talk to the director. And they said, what do you want from him? And I said, well, that's none of your business. If I wanted to talk to you, I would talk to you, but I want to talk to him. So, and because it's a hierarchical organization, they're not really sure that, I'm a kid in front of the building or someone from CIA calling. So they always pass you on to a superior. And eventually I got all the way up to the secretary of the director. And she said, what do you want? And I said, I want to talk to the director. And what do you want from him? And I said, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll tell him. So she said, wait a moment. He really picked up the phone. And he said, so how did you get my number? So I told him. And he started laughing. And he said, oh, you know what? I'll give you my number now. And when you come to Belarus, you can call me and I'll let you in the archive. And I said, no need. I'm in. If you look out of the window, I'm in that phone booth, so I'll be right over. So he really, he had a lot of really funny stories about, KGB. You kind of imagine it as this invincible organization, and they're actually not very professional. I asked him about it because I was followed. Anyone with a camera is followed in Belarus, and I have some tricks, and that I knew that they went through my stuff, and I said, look, are they so professional that they want me to know that I'm being followed, or so unprofessional that they don't realize that I know that I'm being followed? And he looked at me and he said, you know that I don't know. But anyway, he had a lot of stories. But so he actually allowed me to go into the archive, and I got some kind of a minder, and we went. They opened. There were these boxes and boxes, and they took out a few, and there were lots of other interesting boxes, but which they did not take out, and there was this little room. It's a building. It looks scary. It was built by German POWs in Stalinist style in the 50s, and very high ceilings and very narrow corridors. And I was looking through the material, and there was the guy who was supposed to keep an eye on me, and he was getting bored, obviously. So he said, "Do you mind if I go for a cigarette?" I'm like, "No, don't smoke a whole pack. So he went out, smoked a cigarette, and he said, "Can I go for lunch? I'm really hungry." I'm like, "Look, I still have so much material here. Of course, go." So he left, and so the moment he left, I started running around the building, kind of a little afraid I'm gonna get lost. And who has keys from everything? Janitors, exactly. So I found a cleaning lady, and it cost me a couple of dollars, but I did manage to get the keys. Because even in the super secret archive, you have to clean the floor. So I went, actually, I needed to confirm some things that Czech partisans told me and German partisans told me. So I found the boxes. I was a little sweaty because they caught me. I probably would have spent a little more time in Belarus than I would have liked. But sometimes you have to get material in this way as well. And actually, it's on the other. But I'll play another. This is from a film that we are not screening here. If you are interested in actually seeing the films, 2 of them are screening tomorrow. But this is from the first film about Latvia. These are all.
The hunger was undescribable. You didn't save anything for later on. You ate it because you didn't know what happened to you. Somebody might steal it out of your pocket, which also happened.
Honza Kohn, ten začal zvádět, někdo mu ukradl chleba. A ten, který to ukradl, tak ten to nesmě, ten to měl. Takže měl 2 chleby. Tak ho tam mlátí.
If you live under cruel circumstances, you become cruel yourself. Or you're dead.
Yeah, so for example, these are stories that you have to really establish a relationship with that person, because sometimes they admitted to killing people and so on. No one tells you that after talking to you for 20 minutes. So even I sometimes, after I interviewed these people, then once it's like a well. With once you dig the well and you connect the, it starts people start talking. So I've seen a lot of interviews of the same people. I was the first one to talk to them. They're very different than the interviews that with me, because even then they left out a lot of the things of this nature. For example, just a week ago I talked to the daughter of one of the men who was actually a doctor in the camp, and they liquidated some of the bad capos, because whenever they were sick, he was giving them injections not to help them but to get rid of them. So these are some of the examples. Maybe I'll take some questions now, I guess.
We have time for a few questions, and then later informally we can maybe speak with Lukasz.
You mentioned there's a showing tomorrow of some of these documentaries. Are we invited?
The question was about the screenings tomorrow. There are 2 screenings. One is at 2 o'clock at the United States Holocaust Museum. And the other one is at Congregation Beit El in the evening. If you take a leaflet there and you go to our web page, the exact time and place is on the front in the news. So you just go to forgottentransports.com and you can find the information about the screenings.
Yes.
My name is Susan Bender. Both my parents are child survivors, and I was kissing regrets this summer for the laying of Stolpersteins, and I'm looking at my family life again. And I'm wondering, do you have footage of in your film about Poland? Do you have the transport to Lodz, because that's where my grandparents went?
Did you all hear the question, or should I repeat it? The lady's parents were from Czech, and she's asking whether I have some footage from Lodz. Actually, I did not. There were several deportation schemes, really, and deportation directions, and I decided not to talk about Lodz, because Lodz was less known, let's say, than Auschwitz, but more known than all these places that I was interested in. But I can tell you, there are films by Pavel Stingl, filmmaker, and he used some footage, or all the footage that's known from Lodz, and he also interviewed quite a few people who were deported to the Lodz ghetto. That's why I decided not to do it, because I felt that this area has been covered more than others.
Time for one more question. Okay.
Yes.
I just want to say how awestruck I am by your work.
Oh, thank you very much.
I've seen a lot of such work, nothing like this, nothing like the devotion to it. It's extraordinary.
Oh, thank you very much.
Absolutely amazing.
It's part of it is actually. Now I consider myself lucky that I wasn't a filmmaker when I started doing this, because I couldn't get a grant. Because whenever I told anyone, look, I want to make 4 feature-length documentaries about the Holocaust, I want to do it in a little different way, and they asked me, so what film school did you go to? And I said, none. And, have you ever held a camera? And I said, no. So they always showed me the door very quickly. So I had lots of time, because I did not have deadlines. So the films actually took 10 years to make. And as I said, they took me to 5 continents and 20 countries. And we got stuff from Nazi families in Argentina and Egypt. And we've been to Eastern Europe, Australia, everywhere with it. And but I could afford to wait. And that's very important if you're doing this, because, for example, sometimes you even got a response 2 years later. When I was looking for, I would never use a story unless I could document it with a time and place precise picture or footage. So I have one story that's really incredible, but maybe I would save it for because it relates to Estonia, and you need to see the film to understand. It's a Romeo and Juliet story in the film. It's incredible. I was looking for that one picture of the girl for 4 years. I talked to several hundred people in the process. But you're looking for a picture of a particular Nazi, for example, and you only know the name. So I write to everyone in Germany of that name, and then I wait. And 2 years later, you get a picture in an envelope, no return address. But in the meantime, I found the picture of the Nazi so I can compare it, because I would also not use it. Even if I get the picture, I wouldn't use it without actually making sure that this is the person. Now things are so much easier. I was, at the very beginning, I befriended people in the police to help me with facial recognition software. Now you can feed it, and it's so easy now. But what you cannot do now is you can identify people, you can identify pictures if you know, but you can't connect them to stories. I was very, very lucky that I could find this material and still match it with the words. Now you have material, you have the words, you can't connect it. So I had the advantage of time and patience, because that was the only way to do it. And I knew that there must be a picture. You just have to wait for it. And if you have a deadline from TV that's sponsoring the film, then you can't do it. So I always try to turn disadvantages into advantages.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Lukasz for his very interesting devotion and work, and thank you for coming to LC. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.